Okay, this is going to be a quick tutorial on keyframing and making things change over time within Resolve, particularly with respect to color grades. So here I have this short little 3-clip sequence that I brought in out of Avid into Resolve, and I've already got it loaded in here. The media is all here, so let's say this was my final cut and I'm ready to get into my coloring. So we know how to do the basics of our coloring. I can go into the color tab and I have all my color wheels here. I have my mixer here and my power windows here. So I can do all these sorts of things. But today what I want to focus on is the specifics of if you need something to change over time. And there's a couple different ways we can do this. And so we'll kind of walk through what those are. So first off, I'm going to do some tracking, which is kind of the simplest thing you can do. Resolve does a pretty good job tracking on its own. I will say if it gets off, it gets off very badly. So you want to keep an eye on it, but it generally can do a pretty good job of this. So first I'm just going to try to give myself a little space here and hide the timeline. Let's start out with a simple little power window here, and we'll kind of put it on his face. And I'm not, for the purposes of today, I'm not going to actually focus on getting great color corrections. You can watch some other tutorials about how to do that. I really want to just focus on sort of movement aspects. So what I'm going to do is do some color corrections that are going to be really obvious so you can kind of see what's happening. So let's just say in this case, we're going to kind of shift everything in there kind of blue-purple. Okay. And maybe we could soften this up a little bit. You can see we've got this color correction kind of tied to his face here. Now the challenge is when he moves, that color correction is not necessarily going to move with it. So you can see that that's not staying with his face. So this would be a good place. There's not a ton of movement in the shot. It's something pretty straightforward to track. So this would be a good place to actually use some tracking. So I'm going to click over here to the tracker tab. Also note this is one of the things that is really easy to do on the control surface. So if you're working in the lab and have the tangent element control surface, there's some buttons just immediately available to this, so you don't have to go in to the menus and stuff like that. But you can see I have some play controls here. I can track forward or backward. What I usually like to do is kind of start at the beginning of a shot and track forward from there. In this case, I've started in the middle of the shot. You can see my cursor is here. So we're going to track forward from there, and then we'd ultimately have to track backward. So I'm just going to hit track forward. You can see Resolve does a pretty good job keeping that with it. And it doesn't always hit kind of exactly where we want, but that's actually pretty good. And I'm going to undo that track for a second just to show you. Okay, so we kind of started like about here. So I could also do some other things like part of what was happening there was it turned his head, and you'll notice the tracker tried to kind of turn with him, but what that did was kind of left the back his head exposed. So I'm going to take off the 3D here and see if that works any better, because really I just want to say like wherever his head is, whatever side of his face is showing, I kind of want to keep that same color correction on. So that worked a little bit better. And then what we would also do is say, okay, we were good here. I need to also track backwards to get the beginning of that shot. And so now what we've got is this color correction pretty much stays with him. And like I said, it's not perfect. But you can see that's doing a pretty good job sticking with it. And we could go in and, when we talk about keyframing, we could go and keyframe this and adjust it a little further. But that's not bad for the tracker. Okay, so that's one of your options that you have available to you, is just using the tracker. This generally works pretty well on things that are relatively stationary and simple to track. So a good example here, if we look at like this desk, let's say I wanted to do some particular correction to that desk. Let's make a node here, and let's disable this one, node here. Okay. Let's say we wanted to do something to this table here, and let's say just the one on the left, and I can also add some, oops, let's actually turn that off. Get one of these. So I switch from the rectangular tracker to the polygon tracker, which is going to let me put in some additional keyframes here if I'm trying to get a particular shape, but I'm not going to worry about kind of hitting this exactly, but let's say we did something like that, okay? And so I've got that table kind of outlined, and if we're really detailed about this, I would worry about like hitting his bag and stuff and try to avoid all that, but just for proof of concept here, we'll do that, and I'm gonna go ahead and just track forward on that. And that's the kind of thing that Resolve can track really well, because it's not changing angles or anything, it's really just kind of changing scale and position within the frame. And Resolve does very well on that sort of thing, so that would be a pretty good track on that. You can notice at the end it's not really picking up the top of the table. I think that was more on, yeah, kind of like as he moves his well, it stayed kind of where we had told it to, then the angle changed a little bit and it lost the very top of this. So again, we'd have to do some tweaking, but that's the general idea of tracking. Okay, enough with that. Let's talk about some other options for how to control some of these things. So something else that I like to play with that's actually pretty powerful is my keying. So what this is basically saying how much of this effect should I apply. So let's say, for example, that in this shot, there's this lighting change in the middle, and maybe I have a color grade that I do here at the beginning, and let's say maybe I want to overall kind of darken it down a little bit, and okay, and again, to just kind of keep things obvious, you can see, let's say we kind of skewed this all green here. Okay, so let's say that I had this look that I liked for the beginning, but then when the lighting changed, I actually don't like that look. I wanted it to go back to the original. So there's a couple ways I could do this. I could make a couple copies of the clip and layer them in the timeline and have one of them sort of dissolve into the other or something. But this is also a place where I can play with some keying, and I'll kind of introduce keyframes here as well. So go into the key, and what you'll see here is the key output is kind of how much of that effect do I end up applying. So there's my original, there's kind of double the gain, and so 1 is complete exactly what you were going for. And let's kind of do something even weirder to make sure that it's visible when we're kind of doing that versus when we're not. Okay, so very obvious whether that is in or not here at the end. So what I can do is I'm going to keyframe this corrector, and so I'm going to say, okay, what I want to do is have it normal. Let's just, again, pretend we like this. And then it's going to kind of turn off as that lighting changes there over these couple frames. So what I can do here, these little, you'll notice down here in the keyframe section, I have little diamond indicators, which are the keyframes within Resolve. And those are telling me which things can I sort of live keyframe right now. And by default, they're all off, which is good, because I don't want every time I change something for it to try to make a keyframe. But I can, in this case, I'm just going to turn this corrector on and say, corrector number 3, this one that I'm working on, I want to keyframe that right now. And so what I want to do is, by the time that light's all the way off, I want this to be 0. I don't want to have that at all. And you can see it puts a little keyframe in for that corrector. And then let's go back here and kind of right before the light starts changing, I'm going to go to 1. So I want all of that effect there. And you see now I have 2 keyframes, and so I have that effect, and then as the light changes, that effect goes away. And you can see kind of we get this sort of middle ground where you see it changing, and I could adjust this and say, I actually want that to finish a frame earlier. Let's move that up. Let's actually move it up even another frame. And move this one back a frame. I'm trying to catch sort of exactly where that transition happens. Okay, so we get something like that. And that works fine, and I'm done keyframing it, so I'm going to turn this off. This is the big warning I want to give in this video, is keyframing resolve is great to have that available. You can keyframe all sorts of things, which is awesome. It is very easy to accidentally keyframe things that you didn't mean to. So I want to make sure I only kind of have this on when I'm actually trying to do a keyframe and really want to work with something at that moment. So that's a sort of simple one that's basically an on and off, right? I went from having the effect completely on to having it completely off, and you can obviously go somewhere in the middle. If you want to leave a little bit of the effect on or something, you can. So that's kind of using this key option here. Now let's see kind of what else we can do with the keyframing. And let's just say that during this early part, maybe I wanted some of the colors to change or something. So I could do this and just turn on keyframing for that corrector. Now the problem with this is means everything in that corrector is now keyframeable. So anything I start doing to it is all going to get keyframed. Even if I was just trying to adjust something that I wanted to stay the same for the whole shot, it's going to keyframe that. So a good example of this would be, let's say that I had a power window or something that I was trying to keyframe. In fact, let's do that. So I turn this off for the moment, and let's just say, for no good reason, we wanted this to kind of start over here and move over here. Again, not going for good color correction here, just kind of trying to show you the concepts. So I could do this and turn this on and say, okay, so at this point I want this over here, and then as we get later in the shot, I want this to move over here. Right, and that works so far so good. Now where I get into trouble would be if I'm looking at this and like, actually that wasn't quite the color correction I want. Let me just adjust the lift and the offset here a little bit and do something a little different. Okay, yeah, that looks better. What I just did without, probably intentionally meaning to do that is I just keyframed that at this point I changed that color correction, but as I go into other points, that color correction has been keyframed. Now it turns out that since that's the only place where I did anything to the color, we're not actually seeing an effect. But let's say I got over here and said, yeah, that's still not quite right. Let's, make this red or something like that. Okay, that looks better. And I was really just trying to change the overall color grade and tweaking it, which you often do over the course of working on a shot. You keep tweaking it. What I actually just did was now I've keyframed that color grade. So it remembers that over here I did something, and it changes that, and then over here I did something, and so it's actually shifting the color grade throughout that. So I just undid that. Take a couple of steps back here. So what I would actually recommend is not kind of turning that on overall. What I can do is drop this down, and I can see what are all the things going on in here, and I can specifically do those. So let's say I want to keyframe this power window. So I want that to go where I move it, but I'm not turning on the color corrector. Okay, so I'm going to add a keyframe in here, and I'm going to say here we want the gain to be like that. And, we still don't really like that look. Let's actually, go black and white or something. So I'm still working on the look, but you'll notice when I'm doing that, it's doing that for the whole shot now because I'm not keyframing the color correction. I've turned off the keyframing for that, and I'm just working specifically with this particular part of the corrector. So in most cases, I would recommend not just sort of turning on or off keyframing for an entire corrector unless you're going to be really careful with it. And instead, dropping down this box and just doing the adjustments to the specific things you want to do. And that applies not just within the correctors, but also, if I go into my sizing tab, I can adjust some of these things differently than rather than doing all of them together. One note here of caution is now I've enabled this circle window, and if I pull this back up, I don't see here that that's enabled. This isn't sort of highlighted. It doesn't look like it is. But if I move this around, you saw, here, let's do it again. There's no keyframe here. If I move this around, it does add a keyframe. So the dangerous version of this is now I'm actually keyframing things, even though I sort of have active keyframing, even though I look over here and this is not turned on. So again, lots of things you can do with the keyframing. It's very powerful. It's a great tool to have in here, but I just think the implementation in Resolve, I know personally has led me sometimes to accidentally keyframe things I didn't mean to, and then you have to go back and try to erase those or fix that. Something you can do if you're concerned about that is you can lock these things. So for instance, I could lock the color correction and say, hey, no matter what I do, even if I turn on color correction, or sorry, turn on keyframing for this, and I adjust something here, it's not going to let me adjust it because I've locked that. I'm going to try to move this here. This actually is letting me do that. Let's see if I go to a different frame here. So that's interesting. It's letting me change some. Oh yeah, it's letting me change some of the things, not others, because this is locked right now. Let's see if I unlock that. It'll let me do that. Whoops. So I didn't want to keyframe that. Okay. Now if I change something. See, it's not adding any keyframes. It's just sort of changing that without keyframing it at this point because I have that one locked. Okay, so that's basically the idea of that. I can, let's say I screwed something up and like, oh man, I just accidentally put in this keyframe I didn't want. Let's actually get rid of this one in the color corrector. I can right click on it and I can delete that. Except this is locked, so let's try that again. Delete, and it's gone. Turn all this off. I can move these in times if I want, that to happen earlier. And this is kind of a nice display. This one at the top here is showing me anytime there's any kind of keyframe on that corrector, and then I can scroll down within here and see, so like these last two I can see are within the, what's calling the defocus tab. These first ones are the circular power window. If I had something changed with the curve or a gradient window or the color corrector or qualifier, any of those will show up here, but then at the top I can kind of see anytime there's a keyframe in existence somewhere. So that is actually pretty handy. And that's the basics of making things change over time in Resolve. So your tools, you got the tracker, which is limited, but very the fastest and kind of most effective way to do things sometimes. You have what they're calling the defocus tab here, or was in the defocus category of keyframes, but really is the sort of keyer here, where I can adjust that. And this is something I use a lot if I need a grade to change over time. So for instance, maybe something was, the camera was panning and the lighting's kind of different in one area than another. So kind of as it pans, I might adjust this key output to sort of switch myself from one type of grade to another type of grade. And then lastly, we have the keyframing tab over here. which, like I said, is super powerful. You can keyframe just about everything. It's just something to be careful of because it's really easy to accidentally put in keyframes that you didn't want to, or to not keyframe the thing that you thought you were doing. So you just want to make sure anytime you have any of these turned on that you're being really conscious about what you're doing and that it's doing what you intend. I will say within all of Resolve, and I've done a lot of color correction in here, the thing that I've screwed up the most personally is trying to keyframe one thing and accidentally keyframing something else along the way that then I have to go back and adjust or delete those keyframes because those accidentally got in that I was not intending. So I would say, at least in my personal experience, it's one of the easiest places to make mistakes and do something you didn't mean to do. And the challenge with it is you don't always realize at the moment you did it. Sometimes it's 10 minutes further on, you're like, wait, why is this thing changing? You're like, oh, right, I changed the color correction while I was keyframing that power window, and now it put in a keyframing for the color correction that I didn't actually want in there. So just be careful with that. And those are your basic options for changing things over time within Resolve.